Nearly 20 years ago, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ made as one of its 4 priorities to be an anti-racism, pro-reconciliation church. And just over 50 years ago, the African American body of disciples, then known as the National Christian Missionary Convention, merged with the white body of disciples, the International Convention of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Preston Taylor, Black entrepreneur and benefactor to the Black disciples tradition, charged the white church by saying, in essence, that if you want to be the church you say you are, you will have to work with us to become one church. In other words, the white church needed the Black church in order to become fully one in witness to the love of Jesus Christ. The disciples of Christ since 1969 have endeavored to be one church, but it is still 80% white, 10 to 11% Black, 6 to 7% Hispanic, and 1 to 2% Asian and Pacific Islander. The challenge as disciples, little d, to be followers of Christ, is not to be just the church we say we are, but to be the church that Jesus has called us to be. And that is the challenge for all mainline, predominantly white denominations. To be an anti-racist church is not a political statement. It is a deeply theological Christian statement. When Jesus is asked in Matthew 22, what is the greatest commandment, he replies with words that Christians are familiar with. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And he said the second was like it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. As Jesus prepared to leave his disciples, he also taught them in John 13, verses 33 and 34, that they should love one another as he had loved them. By this, he said, will everyone know that you are my disciples. The disciple whom Jesus loved, John, writes more of love in 1 John 3, verses 17 and 18. And it gets clearer. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. As Christians, we are called to live out this love in action. And that means that every day we must make choices, not only about what we do, but about the resources we have and how we will use them, not just as families and individuals, but as congregations, neighborhoods, cities, towns, states, and nations. If we believe in the limitless, boundless love of God, that we must love one another as Jesus loved us, that we are called by God to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves, then we must affirm the human dignity of every person. And we must work to dismantle the systemic sin and injustice of racism and any system that allows or permits any of us to have less or be less than all that God has created. Because when we love our neighbor as ourselves, we value our neighbor as much as we value ourselves. We must see everyone whom God has created as good, inherently good, simply because they are created by God. Good meaning they have worth, that they have value. When we value each other as ourselves, then we want for each other what we want for ourselves. It's not enough to seek quotas and think that we fix the problem or make statements or even be content with food pantries and homeless shelters. And that's good mission work, but it does not dismantle the systems that oppress. We must work so that each one of us has enough to provide for our families safe, clean, decent housing, decent, clean water, health care, education that's not dependent upon a zip code or property assessments. wages that don't require 4 or 5 jobs just to live in substandard housing, when we value one another as we value ourselves, as God values, we understand that racism is an affront to God because it has institutionalized that sin. It has institutionalized some crazy idea that is not of God, that differences must be made deficient. The stain of slavery will haunt the United States as long as the descendants of enslaved people are kept from fully flourishing as human beings. Again, how does God's love abide in anyone who sees a need, has the resources, and yet refuses to help? How can we say that we love God whom we have not seen and yet not love our fellow human beings whom we have seen? When we allow systemic racism to persist, we are saying to God that we do not respect those whom you have made. We are arrogant if we think that we can decide whom God loves, whom God values. We cannot limit God in that way, or God is simply not God, and the message of Jesus Christ rings hollow. The mainline, predominantly white church cannot be content with simply the mere presence of people of color within it, not even if the head of the denomination happens to be a person of color. If we are fighting to dismantle the sin of racism and the structures that perpetuate it within the United States, then we must be the church we say we are and show up, stand up, and speak up. We must also be full citizens of the United States and fight for the right for all to participate in free and fair elections in this country. We have the right and the responsibility to participate in elections to determine who our leaders are simply because we are citizens. And as Christians, we must work to elect leaders who will work with us for those things that we value so that we can be the church and that collectively we can be the nation that we say we are. That means that every day we're making choices, not only about who we will elect, but what policies we will support. We will advocate, not just speak, but advocate for change using the systems of this representative democracy. Every day we must make choices, and those choices will either be a testimony to the limitless love of God or a damning indictment of the emptiness of a religion and a people who have lost their soul. We must hold our society accountable to be the nation we say we are, and as Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, disciples, big D and little d, we want to participate in the full reign of God, of God's love fully being manifest on the earth. Our witness is hollow unless we stand up, show up, and speak up, unless we vote and make decisions and hold elected officials accountable to participate with us in the full flourishing of all humanity. We are free to worship and think as we choose, but we make choices based on what we believe God is calling us to be. And if we believe that we are being called to be anti-racism, pro-reconciling church, then we've got to make some choices. And that includes choices in the ballot box. Faith is on the ballot. Love is on the ballot. Not just this year, but every election, every time.